When was the Wall Street Journal first published?
The newspaper, considered one of the world's best and certainly the preeminent American financial periodical, was first published in 1889, 7 years after the Dow Jones and Company. The comma between the two names was later dropped. Was founded by financial reporters Charles Henry Dow, 1851 to 1902, and Edward Davis Jones, 1856 to 1920. Since the founding of the New York Stock Exchange, NYSE, in 1792, business reporting had been largely based on rumor or speculation. Dow and Jones were determined to provide American businesspeople and investors with up-to-date and accurate reporting on the stock market. In its first 7 years of business, their publishing company grew from 6 employees to a staff of 50. In 1889, Dow and Jones expanded their 2-page daily newspaper, titled Customer's Afternoon Letter, into the Wall Street Journal. The paper's stated goal was to give full and fair information regarding fluctuations in the prices of stocks, bonds, and some commodities. Further, the focus was to be on news rather than opinion. The paper began publishing composite lists of major stocks in 1884. In the decades since, it has expanded coverage to include all facets of the business and economic world and now caters to the leisure interests of business people by publishing reports on the arts, travel, sports, and other recreational activities.
What were scalawags?
Scalawags was a derogatory term used by white Southerners to refer to those white Southerners who supported or were sympathetic to the goals of the Republican lawmakers during Reconstruction. 1865 to 77, the years of rebuilding that followed the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. The Republican Party was the object of much contempt in the American South during the mid to late 1860s. Congress was dominated by radical Republicans who were able to overturn presidential vetoes to achieve their goals. While President Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, supported a lenient policy toward the Southern rebel states, Congress favored a more gradual approach to reunification. In order to prevent another resurgence in the South, Congress delayed the readmission of former Confederate states until Republican governments could be established in them. Congress was also determined to enact legislation and sponsor constitutional amendments that would extend the rights of citizenship to freed slaves. After 4 years of brutal combat during the war, many Southerners saw fit to side with the Union and with the Republican lawmakers who were determining Reconstruction policy. President Andrew Johnson had proved himself an ineffectual leader, and Congress had mustered enough votes to repeatedly override him. In fact, they impeached him in 1868. Some whites in the South, contemptuously called scalawags, joined with northern businessmen and politicians. Derisively called carpetbaggers, as well as the freed slaves to forge a new South.
What did Shakespeare study?
It is thought that William Shakespeare, 1564 to 1616, attended the King's New School, the local grammar school in Stratford-upon-Avon, England, where the main course of instruction was in Latin. There, students were taught rhetoric, logic, and ethics, and studied works by classical authors Terence, Plautus, Cicero, Virgil, Plutarch, Horace, and Ovid. It is believed that this was the extent of Shakespeare's education. There is no evidence that he attended a university.
Why was the Persian Gulf War important?
The Six-Week War, telecast around the world from start to finish, February-April 1991. Was significant because it was the first major international crisis to take place in the post-Cold War era. The United Nations proved to be effective in organizing the coalition against aggressor Iraq. Leading members of the coalition included Egypt, France, Great Britain, Saudi Arabia, Syria, and the United States. The conflict also tested the ability of the United States and the Soviet Union, then still in existence as such, to cooperate in world affairs.
Why did President Lincoln issue the Emancipation Proclamation before the end of the Civil War?
As the war raged between the Confederacy and the Union, it looked like victory would be a long time in the making. In the summer of 1862 things seemed grim for the Federal troops when they were defeated at the Second Battle of Bull Run, which took place in northeastern Virginia on August 29 to 30. But on September 17, with the Battle of Antietam, in Maryland, the Union finally forced the Confederates to withdraw across the Potomac into Virginia. That September day was the bloodiest of the war. President Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865, decided that this withdrawal was success enough for him to make his proclamation. And on September 22, he called a cabinet meeting. That day he presented to his advisers the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. The official Emancipation Proclamation was issued later. On January 1, 1863. This final version differed from the preliminary one in that it specified emancipation was to be effected only in those states that were in rebellion, i.e. the South. This key change had been made because the President's proclamation was based on congressional acts giving him authority to confiscate rebel property and forbidding the military from returning slaves of rebels to their owners. Abolitionists in the North criticized the president for limiting the scope of the edict to those states in rebellion, for it left open the question of how slaves and slave owners in the loyal, northern, states should be dealt with. Nevertheless, Lincoln had made a stand, which served to change the scope of the Civil War, 1861–65, to a war against slavery. On January 31, 1865, just over 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, Congress passed the 13th Amendment, banning slavery throughout the United States. Lincoln, who had lobbied hard for this amendment, was pleased with its passage. The Confederate States did not free their 4 million slaves until after the Union was victorious, on April 9, 1865.
Why were the Rosenbergs tried?
Husband and wife Julius, 1918–1953, and Ethel Rosenberg, 1915–1953, were tried for conspiracy to commit wartime espionage. Arrested in 1950, the Rosenbergs were charged with passing nuclear weapons data to the Soviets, enabling the Communists to develop and explode their own atomic bomb, an event that had been announced to the American public by President Truman on September 23, 1949. As the realization set in that the United States could now be the victim of an atomic attack, the anxieties of the Cold War heightened.
What was the Holy Roman Empire?
The Holy Roman Empire, sometimes abbreviated HRE, was a loose federation of German and Italian states. Originally formed on Christmas of AD 800, when Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, 742–814, was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III, c. 750–816. But after Charlemagne's death, the empire lapsed and was not fully reinstated until Otto I, 912–973, was crowned emperor. Though the empire was strongly associated with the Roman Catholic Church, disputes between emperors and popes began in the mid-1100s. In 1250 Pope Innocent IV, d. 1254, was successful in gaining independence from the empire for the Italian city-states. Later in the history of the Holy Roman Empire, the House of Habsburg rose to power. But after the 1648 signing of the Peace of Westphalia, which recognized the sovereignty of all the states of the empire, the title of Holy Roman Emperor was for the most part an honorific one. With the exception of a 5-year period, 1740–45, the family continued to hold power. Until 1806, when Emperor Francis II, 1768–1835, declared the end of the Holy Roman Empire.
How did the British come to control much of North America during colonial times?
British and French explorers laid claim to many parts of what is now the United States. During the late 1600s and into the mid-1700s, the two European powers fought a series of 4 wars in their struggle for control of territory in North America. 3 of the wars broke out in Europe before they spread to America, where British and French colonists fought King William's War. 1689–97, Queen Anne's War, 1702–13, and King George's War, 1744–48. King William's War saw no gains for either side. After Queen Anne's War, however, both sides signed the Treaty of Utrecht, in which France ceded Newfoundland, Acadia, and the Hudson Bay Territory to Britain. The struggle between England and France was not settled until a 4th war, the French and Indian War, 1754–63, from which Britain emerged the victor.
What were knights?
In the Middle Ages, 500–1350, knights were armed and mounted warriors who were also landholders. In other words, they were noblemen who took up arms. A knight might have been the lord of a manor who vowed to fight for the feudal lord, the lord of the fief where the manor was situated. During the Carolingian Age, during the 8th and 9th centuries, when a monarchy was established in Western Europe, a feudal lord might also have been a knight in service to the king. In times of war, any man who pledged loyalty to his lord and took up arms on his behalf would become a knight, who later might receive lands from the lord or king as repayment. During the Crusades, 1096–1291, knights were made of men who were not landowners. They were instead designated by primogeniture. The eldest son would bear the honor of becoming a knight. Knighthood was traditionally conferred by a blow on the shoulder with the flat side of a sword. Feudal knighthood ended by the 16th century. Today, the only vestige of this tradition is found in Britain, where knighthood is an honorific designation conferred by the king or queen on a noble or commoner for extraordinary achievement.
When was our system for notating music developed?
The innovation came in the early 11th century, when Guido of Arezzo, c. 991–1050, an Italian monk, devised a precise system for defining pitch. Guido was a leading music teacher and theorist in his day. As such, he was invited in about 1028 to Rome, where he presented a collection of religious anthems to Pope John XIX. Guido used a system of 4 horizontal lines, a staff, on which to chart pitch, and he used the syllables ut, later replaced with do, re, mi, fa, sol, and la to name the first 6 tones of the major scale. Before Guido developed his precise method for teaching music, singers had to learn melodies by memorizing them, a process that took many years. Using his notating system, singers were able to sight-read melodies. Guido's famous treatise, Micrologus, was one of the most widely used instruction books of the Middle Ages, 500-1350.
Why is stem cell research controversial?
Stem cell research raises important bioethical issues. Stem cells have the potential to develop into all body tissues, and they may be able to replace diseased or defective human tissue. The best source for these cell clusters is human embryos, which are destroyed when the stem cells are extracted. Opponents to the research, including any on the religious right who also oppose abortion, argue that the embryo is a potential human life and therefore should not be destroyed for the sake of science. But proponents of the controversial research say that a variety of treatments and cures for diseases could be gained through scientific advancements made because of stem cell research. Supporters add that the embryos cannot develop on their own, and therefore should be put to use for the sake of better medicine which could help people who suffer from many different diseases, including diabetes, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's, thus improving and extending human life. It is important to note that the embryos exist in laboratories because of advances previously made in reproductive science. In August 2001, the George W. Bush administration moved cautiously forward on the issue by allowing stem cell research as long as it is limited to existing cells, the embryos having already been destroyed. In other words, new stem cells cannot be created strictly for the purpose of laboratory work. Bush said he concluded that federal funding should be used to support research on 60 existing genetically diverse stem cell lines, which have the ability to regenerate themselves indefinitely. The president acknowledged the complexity of the issue, saying in a radio address, "At its core, this issue forces us to confront fundamental questions about the beginnings of life and the ends of science. It lies at a difficult moral intersection, juxtaposing the need to protect life in all its phases with the prospect of saving and improving life in all its stages. But," he added, "for the existing stem cell lines, the life and death decision has already been made." Over the next few years, state legislatures took up the issue, creating a patchwork of policies across the nation by 2005.
Mitchell later said that as he sat thinking about the tragic news, he wondered to himself, "Here I am running around the world doing all these things, why not do them at home?"
Mitchell had spent his youth in Harlem, and he felt he should return there to establish a school to pass on his knowledge to others and to give black dancers the opportunity to perform. The primary purpose of the school was to promote interest in and teach young black people the art of classical ballet, modern and ethnic dance. thereby creating a much-needed self-awareness and better self-image of the students themselves. The idea was a success. During the 1970s and 1980s the company toured nationally and internationally, often performing to sell-out crowds and participating in prestigious events including international art festivals, a state dinner at the White House, and the closing ceremonies of the 1984 Olympic Games. Today, the Dance Theater of Harlem is acknowledged as one of the world's finest ballet companies. Not only did Mitchell succeed in giving black dancers the opportunity to learn and to perform, he effectively erased color barriers in the world of dance, testimony to the universality of classical ballet.
Of the great trio of high Renaissance artists Leonardo, Michelangelo, and Raphael, who is considered the master?
Most historians and critics agree that it was Raphael Sanzio. 1483–1520, who most clearly stated the ideals of the High Renaissance. Though arch-rivals Leonardo da Vinci, 1452–1519, and Michelangelo Buonarroti, 1475–1564, influenced the younger Raphael, he developed his own style. A prolific painter, he was also a great technician whose work is characterized by a seemingly effortless grace. His most well-known work is the School of Athens, 1509–11. which has been called a complete statement of the High Renaissance in its artistic form and spiritual meaning. The painting, which projects a stage-like space onto a two-dimensional surface, reconvenes the great minds of the ancient world: Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, Diogenes, Euclid, for an exchange of ideas. Raphael even included himself in this gathering of greatness. But it seems only appropriate for the master to be in such company, in this work. Raphael has achieved the art of perspective, bringing the discipline of mathematics to pictorial space where human figures appear to move naturally.
When did the anti-slavery movement begin?
In the United States, the campaign to prohibit slavery strengthened in the early 1800s. Across the Atlantic, abolitionists had successfully lobbied for the outlaw of slave trade in Great Britain by 1807. The following year, the U.S. government also outlawed the trade, but possession of slaves remained legal and profitable. In the 1830s, the call to abolish slavery and emancipate slaves became an active movement in the United States, precipitated by a revival of evangelical religion in the North. Abolitionists, believing slavery is morally wrong and violates Christian beliefs, called for an end to the system, which had become critical to the agrarian economy of the southern states, where plantations produced cotton, tobacco, and other crops for domestic and international markets.
What was the Nanking Massacre?
One of the most brutal chapters in modern history, the Nanking Massacre, also called the Rape of Nanking, was a mass execution of hundreds of thousands of unarmed Chinese civilians by invading Japanese soldiers in December 1937 and January 1938. No one knows for certain how many people were murdered in the mass killings, but most estimates place the number at 300,000, with another 80,000 people raped and tortured, including women and children. On December 13, 1937, the Japanese Royal Army swept into the eastern Chinese city of Nanking, today called Nanjing, which was then the capital of China. In the weeks that followed, the Japanese soldiers went on an orgy of violence. The atrocities were documented on film by the Japanese themselves as well as by helpless foreigners in the city at the time of the seizure. Surviving photos show unimaginable cruelties. It is believed that Japan's military had been trained to carry out the killings and atrocities in order to make an example of Nanking to other Chinese people, thereby facilitating Japan's intended occupation. The horrific event was the source of recent controversy stirred by the 1997 publication of The Rape of Nanking, The Forgotten Holocaust of World War II by Iris Chang. 1968, a historian and journalist whose grandparents narrowly escaped the massacre. Unlike Germany, which accepted responsibility for the Holocaust of Jews during World War II. 1939–45, and whose Nazi leaders were tried in number at Nuremberg. Japan never acknowledged its crimes committed at Nanking. After World War II, only a few of Japan's military leaders were tried and found guilty of war crimes related to the taking of Nanking. This chapter in Japan's national history has been largely denied by its officials, some of whom accused Chang of issuing propaganda. Chang stood by her research, which included interviews with survivors, as well as with Japanese soldiers who participated in the violence. The massacre remains a deeply divisive event between the two nations and their people.
How did cable TV develop?
The industry had its beginnings in the 1970s, when home box office HBO started to beam its signal to customers on a subscription basis. It was a radical concept: let audiences pay direct for the programming, in this case, movies, rather than having it wholly supported through advertising and, in some cases, syndication fees. Another development during that decade proved to have lasting effect: Southern businessman Ted Turner, 1938, bought an independent TV station based in Atlanta and dubbed it a superstation. WTBS was soon made available to some 10 million subscribing households and was the beginning of Turner's cable TV empire, which would later include cable news network, CNN, CNN's headline news, Turner Network Television, TNT, and, briefly, the music network VH1. Soon there were a number of niche-based cable networks airing programming around the clock: music television, MTV was reaching teens and 20-somethings, Lifetime targeted women, ESPN focused on sports, black entertainment television. BET catered to the African American audience, and American movie classics, AMC appealed to a cross-section of American viewers who share a fondness for old, mostly black and white, movies. By the 1980s, the three major television networks, which had risen to power in the 1950s and had remained on the top of their game for the next 2 decades, found that their audience share was dropping. This was aided by the introduction of the upstart Fox television network. Backed by media mogul Rupert Murdoch, 1931. Fox's programming, geared toward a young, hip, and increasingly multicultural audience, found its own following. Soon Americans had more choices than ever before, and for a relatively low subscription cost. By the 1990s, the big three networks, NBC, ABC, and CBS, were reaching only 61% of the television audience. Not to be beaten at their own game, the networks responded to the new competition by producing more cutting-edge shows, programs that likely would not have made it on the air before the advent of cable. Further, they began charging their affiliate stations for programming, a trend begun by CBS in 1992.
When were schools in the United States desegregated?
On May 17, 1954, in the case of Brown v. Board of Education, the Supreme Court ruled, 9-0, that racial segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. The court overturned the separate but equal doctrine laid down in the 1896 case Plessy v. Ferguson. Chief Justice Earl Warren, 1891-1974. Ordered the states to proceed with all deliberate speed to integrate educational facilities. Also in 1954, on November 7, the Supreme Court ordered desegregation of public golf courses, parks, swimming pools, and playgrounds. In the aftermath of these rulings, desegregation proceeded slowly and painfully. In the early 1960s, sit-ins, freedom rides, and similar expressions of nonviolent resistance by blacks and their sympathizers led to a decrease in segregation practices in public facilities. How has the U.S.
Will Mother Teresa be sainted?
As of the early 2000s, Mother Teresa of Calcutta was on the road to sainthood. On October 19, 2003, she was beatified. A key step in the process that began just 2 years after her death. Her worldwide reputation of holiness prompted Pope John Paul II, 1920 to 2005. to waive the customary 5-year waiting period for the cause of canonization to begin. Mother Teresa's heroic virtues, a requirement for sainthood, were well known long before she died. The modern martyr spent nearly 70 years working as a missionary among the poor. The last 50 of them in outreach to society's most downtrodden, the impoverished, sick and dying. She lived modestly, dressed simply, usually in a plain white sari, which she felt identified her with the poor, and devoted herself wholly to helping those society had forgotten. The so-called Saint of the Gutter received worldwide recognition for her work. In 1979 she was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Though she came into contact with some of the world's most influential people, she was unchanged by the attention. When the Pope gave her a Lincoln Continental for her own personal transportation, she auctioned it off to raise needed funds for her works of charity. Reportedly, when she visited Britain's Princess Diana, 1961 to 1997, the nun looked on the large rooms in the royal palace and uttered something to the effect of, "Just think how many people could live in these rooms." Another requirement of sainthood is involvement in miracles. In October 2002 it was reported that Pope John Paul's office had attributed a miracle to Mother Teresa. A young Indian woman was cured of a stomach tumor after praying to her. The Vatican, however, found no scientific explanation for the woman's recovery. On December 20, 2002, the Pope approved the decrees of her heroic virtues and miracles, paving the way for Mother Teresa's beatification in 2003. Her sainthood appeared to be imminent.
Why did the U.S. government order the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II?
After the attack on Pearl Harbor, American citizens of Japanese descent were viewed as threats to the nation's security. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt, 1882–1945, signed an executive order directing that they be moved to camps for containment for the duration of the war. More than 100,000 people, most of them from California and other West Coast states, were rounded up and ordered to live in secure camps. The action drew immediate criticism, with thousands of lives interrupted without cause. The chapter is one of the saddest in American history. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which made reparations to the victims of the Japanese internment. $20,000 was paid to internees, evacuees, and persons of Japanese ancestry who lost liberty or property because of discriminatory action by the federal government during World War II. It also established a $1.25 billion public education fund to teach children and the public about the internment period.
What were Voltaire's beliefs?
The prolific French writer's corpus of 52 works were produced as part of his lifelong effort to expose injustices. Voltaire's famous words, "Écrasez l'infâme," squash that which is evil, encapsulate his tenets. He believed in God, but abhorred priestly, high church, traditions. He spread the doctrines of rational skepticism to the world. He strongly advocated religious and political tolerance. And he held great faith in humankind's ability to strive for perfection. To the European literary world, he embodied the highest ideal of the Age of Reason, also called the Enlightenment. But victims of his wit feared and denigrated him. Celebrated by some during his lifetime, he has certainly been celebrated since. His masterpiece, Candide, 1759, a satirical tale exploring the nature of good and evil, has been translated into more than 100 languages.
What were the Articles of Confederation?
This American document was the forerunner to the U.S. Constitution, 1788. Drafted by the Continental Congress at York, Pennsylvania. On November 15, 1777, the Articles of Confederation went into effect on March 1, 1781, when the last state, Maryland, ratified them. The Articles had shortcomings that were later corrected by the Constitution. They provided the states with more power than the central government, stipulating that Congress rely on the states both to collect taxes and to carry out the acts of Congress. It is largely thanks to Alexander Hamilton, 1755 to 1804, that the Articles were thrown out. Realizing they made for a weak national government, Hamilton led the charge to strengthen the central government even at the expense of the states. Eventually, he won the backing of George Washington, 1732 to 1799, James Madison, 1751 to 1836, John Jay, 1745 to 1829, and others, which led to the convening of the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention, where the ineffectual Articles of Confederation were thrown out and the Constitution was drafted. One lasting provision of the Articles of Confederation was the Ordinance of 1787, signed in an era of westward expansion. The ordinance set the guidelines for how a territory could become a state. A legislature would be elected as soon as the population had reached 5,000 voting citizens, which were men only. And the territory would be eligible for statehood once its population had reached 60,000.
Why is Botticelli's The Birth of Venus famous?
This immediately recognizable painting, c. 1482, is most likely known for its elegant figures, use of pictorial space, and decorative detail, which give the painting a tapestry effect. At the time it was painted, the presentation of a nude Venus was an innovation since the use of unclothed figures in art had been prohibited during the Middle Ages, 500-1350. Botticelli, however, felt free to render Venus in this way since the work was commissioned by Florence's powerful Medici family, who were his patrons. Under their protection, Botticelli could pursue the world of his imagination without fearing charges of paganism and infidelity. Though the birth of Venus is extremely well known, the Magnificat, 1483. Botticelli's round picture of the Madonna with singing angels, is his most copied work.
What was the Tang dynasty?
The Tang, 617 to 907, was the sixth to last Chinese dynasty. It's well known since the period saw great achievements not only in government and business, but in letters and the arts, principally lyrical poetry, formal prose, painting, sculpture, and porcelain pottery. The first published book, the Diamond Sutra, was produced during this time, in 868. Considered a golden age of Chinese civilization, the Tang was also an age of great expansion. At its height, the empire stretched from Turkmenistan in the west to Korea, which was a vassal state, in the east, and from Manchuria to northern India. As a result, trade prospered, with Chinese jade, porcelain, silk, rice, spices, and teas exported to India, the Middle East, and Europe. One historian called the Tang the consummate Chinese dynasty, formidable, influential, and innovative. One of the Tang's innovations was the balance of administrative power. Government was separated into three main branches: the Imperial Secretariat, which organized the emperor's directives into policies; the Imperial Chancellery, which reviewed the policies and monitored bureaucracy; and the Department of State's Affairs, which carried out the policies through the administration of 6 ministries. Add to this triumvirate a board of censors, which ensured that corruption was kept to a minimum. This form of government outlasted the Tang dynasty. Subsequent monarchies perpetuated the system into the 20th century. Yet another example of the forward thinking of the Tang dynasty was a civil service. Candidates for public service were trained in the Confucian principles before they took an exam that would qualify them for official duty.
When was poker invented?
The card game, in which a player bets that the value of his or her hand is higher than those held by the other players, was invented in the 1820s by sailors in New Orleans. The sailors combined the ancient Persian game as NAS with the French game poc, which itself was a derivation of the Italian game Primera, and a cousin of the English game brag. Poker was originally played with 3 cards from a deck of only 32 and included combinations such as pairs and 3 of a kind. The game was later played with 5 cards from a deck of 52 cards, and the draw was also added. Stud poker, where each player is dealt their first card face down and the next 4 cards face up. Didn't come into existence for many years, until about 1864. Other later additions to the game were the straight, a hand consisting of 5 cards in sequence but not of the same suit, and the flush, a hand consisting of 5 cards of the same suit but not in sequence.
Why is Paul Revere's ride so well known?
The April 18, 1775, event was famous in its own right but was memorialized by American writer Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. 1807 to 1882, in his poem, Paul Revere's Ride. The verse contains an error, or perhaps Longfellow simply took literary license. About the night that the American Revolution, 1775 to 83, began, the light signal that was to be flashed from Boston's Old North Church. One light if the British were approaching the Patriots by land and 2 if the approach was by sea. Was sent not to Revere, it was received by Revere's compatriots in Charlestown, now part of Boston proper. However, Revere did ride that night on a borrowed horse. He left Boston at about 10 p.m. and arrived in Lexington at midnight to warn Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were wanted for treason, that the British were coming. The next day, April 19, the battles of Lexington and Concord were fought, starting the Revolutionary War in America. As an American patriot, Revere, 1735 to 1818, was known for his service as a special messenger. So much so that by 1773 he had already been mentioned in London newspapers. Revere also participated in the Boston Tea Party in 1773.
What was the 1990s boom?
It was the longest economic expansion in American history. According to accepted economic indicators, the boom began in March 1991, when the first President Bush was in office, and ended in March 2001. When President George W. Bush was in office. 8 years of the expansion were during the Clinton administration. The hallmarks of the 1990s boom were the creation of almost 24 million jobs, or an average of 200,000 jobs a month, a national unemployment rate that dropped to around 4% for an extended period. Productivity gains month over month, gross domestic product, GDP, growth month over month. Unprecedented investment in the stock market, Wall Street added $10 trillion in wealth over the decade. A bull market fueled by $100 billion in initial public offerings, IPOs, many of them technology stocks. Low interest rates, a low inflation rate averaging 2.6% per year, the elimination of the federal budget deficit, and the addition of dollars to the paychecks of many American workers. The last time the economy had seen similar indicators was during the 1960s. But in January 2000 the boom surpassed all others to become the longest sustained expansion in U.S. history. Economists considered the factors that contributed to the boom. A Christian Science Monitor writer credited a combination of ubiquitous American entrepreneurial spirit, massive amounts of technology, and a man named Greenspan. But Alan Greenspan, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, which controls interest rates, credited information technology as the defining factor of this special period. Its major contribution is to reduce the number of worker hours required to produce the nation's output, said Greenspan. The boom ended in March 2001, along with the end of the dot-com bubble. The nation began a short recession, which ended November 2001, according to economic indicators. The economy then began a slow, and by most indicators, weak recovery.
What alliances were forged during World War I?
In its declaration of war against Serbia in late July 1914, Austria-Hungary was joined in early August by its ally Germany, which together formed the Central Powers. In October 1914 Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire joined the Central Powers. When the fighting began, France, Britain, and Russia threw their support behind Serbia, and together were known as the Allies. The Allies declared war on the Ottoman Empire in November 1914. After Turkish ships bombarded Russian ports on the Black Sea and Turkish troops invaded Russia. Eventually, 20 more nations joined the Allies, but not all of them sent troops to the front. Belgium, Montenegro, and Japan joined the Allies in August 1914. With Japan declaring war on Germany and invading several Pacific islands to drive out the Germans. In 1915 Italy and San Marino joined, as fighting wore on. In 1916, Romania and Portugal became allied nations. And 1917 saw the entry of 8 countries. Most notably the United States and China, but also Liberia, Greece, Siam, Panama, Cuba, and Brazil. Before the war ended in 1918, Guatemala, Haiti, Honduras, Costa Rica, and Nicaragua all became supporters of the Allies.
Were activists the only ones who were vocal about opposing segregation?
No, segregation was opposed at every level of black society, as well as by many whites. The voices of the civil rights movement included wage laborers, farmers, educators, athletes, entertainers, soldiers, religious leaders, politicians, and statesmen, all of whom had experienced the oppression of Jim Crow laws and policies in the United States. Before W.E.B. Du Bois, 1868 to 1963, rose to prominence as an educator and writer, he chose to leave the security of his home in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, to attend college at Nashville's Fisk University. There, in 1885, he encountered Tennessee's Jim Crow laws, which strictly divided blacks and whites. He was so intimidated by the Southern system that he rarely left the campus. And he ultimately returned to New England to complete his studies at Harvard University. He did, however, go back to the South, becoming a professor of economics and history at Atlanta University, 1897 to 1910, 1932 to 44. As one of the first exponents of full and equal racial equality. In 1909 Du Bois helped found the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, which provided leadership during the Civil Rights Movement. In 1942 a young Georgia man named John Roosevelt Robinson, 1919 to 1972, was drafted into the military. Robinson applied for officers' candidate school at Fort Riley, Kansas. And although he was admitted to the program, he and the other black candidates received no training until pressure from Washington, D.C., forced the local commander to admit blacks to the base's training school. Later Robinson became a second lieutenant and continued to challenge the Jim Crow policies on military bases. When the Army decided to keep him out of a game with the nearby University of Missouri because that school refused to play against a team with black members, Robinson quit the base's football team in protest. At Fort Hood, Texas, Robinson objected to segregation on an Army bus. His protests led to court-martial. Acquitted, in November 1944 Robinson was honorably discharged before the end of World War II. 1939 to 45 The Army had no desire to keep this black agitator among the ranks. And, as Robinson later put it, he was pretty much fed up with the service. In 1947 Jackie Robinson became the first black baseball player in the major leagues, when he joined the Brooklyn Dodgers, breaking the color barrier in the national pastime. In the post-war years, American diplomat Ralph Bunche, 1904 to 1971, attracted public attention when he rejected an offer from President Harry Truman, 1884 to 1972, to become an Assistant Secretary of State. Bunche, a Howard University professor who had worked for the Office of Strategic Services during the war, explained that he declined the position because he did not want to subject his family to the Jim Crow laws of Washington, D.C. Bunche spoke out frequently against racism. And in 1944 he co-authored the book An American Dilemma, which examined the plight of American blacks. These are just a few of the many examples of personal protest that signaled the beginning of the civil rights movement in the United States.
Who was Tamerlane?
Tamerlane, 1336 to 1405, was a Central Asian conqueror who gained power in the late 1300s. His Islamic name was Timur. Tamerlane is the English version. He was a barbaric warrior and a brilliant military leader whose fearsome tactics earned him the name Tamerlane the Terrible. By 1370 he was a powerful warlord whose government was centered in the province of Samarkand, in present-day Uzbekistan. In 1383 he launched a series of conquests that lasted more than 20 years and gained him control of a vast region including Iraq, Armenia, Mesopotamia, Georgia, Russia, and parts of India. He died in 1405, on an expedition to conquer China. His body was entombed in an elaborate mausoleum, which is considered a treasure of Islamic art. After his death, his sons and grandsons fought for control of his dynasty, which remained intact for another 100 years. Tamerlane and his heirs built Samarkand into a great city. In its day it was a center for culture and scholarship in Central Asia.
Separation of church and state affected the public schools?
Religion in American public schools continued to be a hot topic throughout the 1900s. But the Supreme Court rulings in the middle of the 20th century proved to have the most bearing on religious practices in state-supported schools. On June 17, 1963, in an 8-1 ruling, the Supreme Court decided that prayer and Bible reading in U.S. public schools were unconstitutional. The decision, in the case of Skemp v. Abington Township, culminated a series of high court rulings over the course of almost 20 years, which gradually removed the practice of religious activities from public schools. The rulings began in 1947 with the New Jersey case of Everson v. Board of Education, in which the court, in a 5-4 vote, defended the use of state funds to transport children to parochial schools, but warned that a wall of separation between church and state must be maintained. In 1948, in McCollum v. Board of Education, the court banned a program of religious instruction from the schools of Champaign, Illinois. In Engel v. Vital, 1962. The justices of the Supreme Court ruled that the state-composed prayer recited in New York classrooms was unconstitutional.
What did lawmakers do to resolve the slavery question before the Civil War?
The mid-1800s were a trying time for the nation. The divide widened between the northern free states and the southern slave states, which were growing increasingly dependent on agricultural slave labor. Government tried but was unable to bring resolution to the conflict over slavery. Instead, its efforts seemed geared toward maintaining the delicate North-South political balance in the nation. After the Mexican War, 1846-48, the issue was front and center as congressmen considered whether slavery should be extended into Texas and the Western Territories. Gained in the Peace Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which officially ended the war. Lawmakers arrived at the Compromise of 1850, which proved a poor attempt to assuage mounting tensions. The legislation allowed for Texas to be admitted to the Union as a slave state. California to be admitted as a free state. Slavery was prohibited, voters in New Mexico and Utah to decide the slavery question themselves. A method called popular sovereignty, the slave trade to be prohibited in Washington, D.C., and for passage of a strict fugitive slave law to be enforced nationally. 4 years later, as it considered how to admit Kansas and Nebraska to the Union, Congress reversed an earlier decision, part of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, that had declared the territories north of the Louisiana Purchase to be free, and set up a dangerous situation in the new states. The slavery status of Kansas and Nebraska would be decided by popular sovereignty, the voters in each state. Nebraska was settled mostly by people opposing slavery, but settlers from both the North and the South poured into Kansas, which became the setting for violent conflicts between pro-slavery and anti-slavery forces. Both sides became determined to swing the vote by sending squatters to settle the land. Conflicts resulted, with most of them clustered around the Kansas border with Missouri, where slavery was legal. In one incident, on May 24, 1856, ardent abolitionist John Brown, 1800 to 1859, led a massacre in which 5 pro-slavery men were brutally murdered as they slept. The act had been carried out in retribution for earlier killings of freemen at Lawrence, Kansas. Brown claimed his was a mission of God. Newspapers dubbed the series of deadly conflicts, which eventually claimed more than 50 lives, Bleeding Kansas. The situation proved that neither congressional compromises nor the doctrine of popular sovereignty would solve the nation's deep ideological differences.
What is Jonas Salk known for?
American physician Jonas Edward Salk, 1914 to 1995, is familiar to many as the inventor of the polio vaccine. In 1952, more than 21,000 cases of paralytic polio, the most severe form of polio, were reported in the United States. An acute viral infection, poliomyelitis, also called polio or infantile paralysis, invades the central nervous system. It is found worldwide and mainly in children. In 1953, after years of research that included sorting through all the studies done on immunology since the mid-1800s, Salk announced the formulation of a vaccine which contained all 3 types of polio known at the time. Salk tested it on himself first, and then on his wife and 3 children. Experiencing no side effects and finding the vaccine to be effective, it was then tested on 1.8 million school children, in a program sponsored by the March of Dimes, then called the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis. In April 1955, the vaccine was pronounced safe and effective. Salk was duly honored, including with a Congressional Gold Medal and a citation from President Dwight D. Eisenhower. 1890 to 1969, 4 years later, American physician Albert B. Sabin, 1906 to 1993, developed an effective polio vaccine that could be taken orally. Versus via injection, it is the sugar cube so well known to people around the world. That vaccine contains live viruses. SOX was a killed virus vaccine. The two vaccines virtually eradicated polio from developed nations.
What is the Mars rover?
The Mars rover is a National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, project launched in June 2003 and that landed on the Red Planet in January 2004. Two rovers, named Spirit and Opportunity, were designed to be robotic geologists, collecting data as they roam the surface of Mars. Each robot has features that NASA described as similar to what any living creature would need during exploration. A body, or structure, to protect the rover's vital organs, brains, or computers, to process information. Temperature controls, including internal heaters and insulation to protect the structure from the elements. A neck and head, or a mast for the cameras to give the rovers a human-scale view, eyes and other senses. Or cameras and instruments that give the rovers information about their environment, wheels and legs for mobility. Arms for reaching, and the ability to communicate, via antennas for speaking and listening. The rovers are powered by batteries and solar panels. Since the first data began to be returned to Earth in early March 2004, the rovers have provided scientists with data and impressive images for research and study. A dramatic finding from the twin rovers was the discovery that the arid planet had once been wet and possibly habitable, based on data collected by Opportunity. Researchers concluded that liquid water was once intermittently present at the Martian surface. Observers can track the progress of Spirit and Opportunity, each exploring different areas of the red planet. At the NASA website, http://marsrovers.jpl.nasa.gov/homeindex.html.
Why was the completion of the Erie Canal important to you? S. Development.
Completed in 1825, the Erie Canal joined the Atlantic Ocean to the Great Lakes, linking the east with the west and for the first time allowing freight and settlers to easily move back and forth between the regions. Begun on July 4, 1817, the canal was sponsored by Governor DeWitt Clinton. 1769 to 1828, of New York, who planned and eventually carried out the huge building project. The waterway was funded by the state of New York, which paid just over $7 million to complete it. The original canal was 363 miles long, 40 feet wide at the surface, and 4 feet deep. It had 83 locks, which raised vessels 562 feet between the Hudson River and Lake Erie. A lock is a section of a canal that can be closed to control the water level. and is then used to either raise or lower a vessel to another body of water. Beginning at Albany, New York, on the Hudson River, which flows into the Atlantic Ocean at New York City. The canal extends west as far as Buffalo, New York, on Lake Erie, one of the 5 Great Lakes. The waterway, which was inaugurated by the run of the barge Seneca Chief on October 26, 1825, could transport passengers aboard boats and move cargo aboard barges, which were pulled by teams of horses and mules on the ground. In spite of the critics, who dubbed the ambitious project Clinton's Wonder and Clinton's Ditch, the canal's positive impact on the American economy was felt within the first decade of its operation. The new transportation route reduced freight rates both eastward and westward, made Buffalo a major port in the region and New York City a major international port, was a catalyst for population growth. In upstate New York and throughout the Old Northwest, the present-day states of Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota, and prompted other states, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, to build canals, further opening up the country's interior to development and commerce. Since crops could be shipped from these lush farmlands and as more farms came into existence, the Erie Canal helped supply the newly arrived immigrants in the eastern cities with food. In turn, they shipped manufactured goods west to the farming communities. The canal was enlarged several times between 1835 and 1862 to increase its capacity. In 1903, New York voted to link the canal with 3 shorter waterways in the state to form the New York State Barge Canal, which opened in 1918.